Two officers humiliated Marcus Reed, a young black lawyer, by dragging him out of court in front of the very clients who trusted him. Their arrogance and prejudice made the injustice cut even deeper, stripping him of dignity in a place meant for fairness. But fate had a twist. Marcus wasn't just a lawyer, he was the newly appointed judge, with the power to turn the tables. Just listen to how this courtroom drama unfolded and why justice, against all odds, prevailed. It was supposed to be a morning like any other inside the Atlanta courthouse. The air carried its usual mixture of tension and routine, a place where lives were argued, judged, and sometimes redeemed. Marcus Reed, 36 years old, strode across the marble floor with quiet purpose. He wasn't just another lawyer. He was the kind who had built a name not through wealth or privilege, but through dedication. For nearly a decade, he had represented people who could not afford seasoned counsel, tenants facing eviction, workers cheated of their pay, young men and women fighting for their futures. Today was no different. Case files rested firmly under his arm, his steps calm but decisive. Marcus believed in this building, in the words carved above its doors, "Justice for all." Those words had guided his entire career, even when the system seemed designed to contradict them. As he entered the courtroom, a shift in atmosphere greeted him. Two uniformed officers stationed by the door, Sergeant Miller and Officer Kane, narrowed their eyes the moment they saw him. Miller, broad-shouldered and rigid, adjusted his stance as though preparing for confrontation. Kane, younger but with the same hard set to his jaw, tilted his head, assessing Marcus not as a professional walking into his place of work, but as an outsider trespassing into forbidden space. "Sir, you can't be in here," Miller barked, his tone more command than inquiry. Marcus paused, the weight of his files pressing against his side. He had faced dismissive looks before, but the outright denial of his presence inside a courtroom, his courtroom for the day, was something else entirely. He raised his chin slightly, answering with a measured calm that he had learned from years of practice. "I'm counsel on this case," Marcus replied, his voice even. He extended his identification, his attorney badge, and the neatly stamped paperwork confirming his role. The documents, proof of his standing, caught the overhead lights as they reflected the polished seal of the court. But Miller didn't move. He didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, Kane leaned forward with a smirk that carried not curiosity but dismissal. "Don't play games with us. Where'd you steal that suit from?" The words sliced through the air. In an instant, the room fell into silence. Spectators, lawyers, and clerks froze, their eyes darting between Marcus and the officers. A quiet gasp echoed from the back row, a woman clutching her purse tighter against her chest, as though bracing for what was about to happen. Marcus's grip tightened on his paperwork. Years of discipline urged him to keep his composure, but beneath his controlled exterior surged disbelief and fury. A lifetime of study, countless late nights preparing cases, all the sacrifices he had made to stand in this very place, and yet, in their eyes, none of it mattered. To them, his very presence was an impossibility. He opened his mouth to speak, to insist, to demand acknowledgment of his role. But before a word could form, Miller stepped forward, grasped his arm, and twisted it behind his back. Kane moved in quickly, forcing him down. The sharp sound of papers scattering across the polished floor echoed louder than any objection. His case files, the careful defense for a struggling mother, the testimony he had spent days preparing, were now strewn like debris. Whispers spread through the gallery. A man in a worn jacket muttered under his breath, "That's his lawyer." A young woman near the front covered her mouth, eyes wide in shock. Marcus felt the weight of every stare. He wasn't simply being restrained, he was being stripped of the image he had worked his entire life to build. In that moment, he wasn't the polished attorney who had walked in with confidence. To the onlookers, he was a man pressed down, silenced, denied the dignity of his profession. His mind raced with a bitter truth. If this could happen here, in open court, before clerks, witnesses, and clients, what did it mean for those without a title or education? For the people he had sworn to defend? The marble walls, once a symbol of fairness, now felt like silent witnesses to humiliation. And as Miller and Kane stood over him, the fury in the room grew heavier than the gavel that had not yet struck. The cold steel cuffs tightened around Marcus's wrists, pressing into the bone with every slight movement. "You're resisting arrest," Sergeant Miller muttered, though Marcus hadn't even shifted his weight. His body remained still, as though any resistance might only fuel their false claim. The room seemed to shrink around him. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the shuffle of papers that had fallen from his grip. Every eye was on him, and none more piercing than those of the people who had trusted him with their lives. Near the back sat Angela Morris, the single mother he had promised to defend against eviction. She had come that morning clutching hope like a lifeline, believing Marcus's skill and commitment could keep a roof over her children's heads. Now her lips trembled, her eyes glassy with tears, as she watched the man she called her advocate dragged away in shackles. To his right, Jamal, a young client barely out of his teens, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Only weeks ago, Marcus had looked him in the eye and assured him, "Justice is slow, but it is real." Jamal's gaze now carried betrayal, not because he blamed Marcus, but because the scene before him shattered the fragile faith he was just beginning to rebuild. If the man in the suit, the one who spoke like he belonged, who carried the law in his hands, could be pulled down in an instant, what chance did Jamal ever have? Marcus saw their despair reflected in their eyes, and a deeper weight pressed onto his chest. The humiliation was not his alone. It rippled outward, confirming every fear his clients held about a system they never believed would protect them. As Miller and Kane escorted him into the dim holding room, Marcus's mind wandered unbidden. He remembered being 12 years old, sitting on the porch with his father, who had worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. "Son," his father had said, his voice heavy with both love and warning, "you'll have to be twice as good, twice as careful, and twice as patient just to be seen as equal. And even then, some folks will only see your skin." Marcus had taken those words not as a defeat, but as a challenge. He had worked harder than his peers, excelled in his studies, earned scholarships, passed the bar, and fought cases others deemed unwinnable. Each victory was a testament that he had risen above bias, that he had proved wrong those who doubted him. But now, with metal cutting into his wrists and his body forced into submission, all those years felt like sand slipping through his hands. Here he was, degraded not for his skill, not for his record, not for his character, but for nothing more than existing in the wrong frame of judgment. Miller leaned casually against the wall, his smirk unshaken. "Bet you thought that law degree made you different, huh?" His tone dripped with condescension, as if Marcus's years of achievement were nothing more than a costume that had finally slipped. Marcus clenched his jaw, refusing to respond. He knew any word spoken in anger could be twisted against him, written into a report that painted him as the aggressor. Silence, though heavy, was his shield. But silence did not dull the ache. The pain wasn't just in his wrists, though the cuffs left their mark. It was in the collapse of a belief he had carried like armor, that the courtroom was sacred, that within its walls truth and fairness held weight. Now he felt that belief falter. The very system he had devoted his life to serve stood complicit, watching his dignity dismantled piece by piece. For Marcus, the greatest wound was not physical. It was the realization of fragility, that respect, titles, and accolades could vanish in an instant when prejudice stood in the doorway. And as he sat in that holding room, the echo of his father's words returned, sharper now than ever before. Hours crawled by before the next session began. The courthouse halls buzzed with low whispers like currents running through water. People spoke in hushed tones about the morning's incident, some in outrage, others in uneasy silence. The officers, Miller and Kane, stood confidently near the front, papers in hand, ready to explain away their treatment of Marcus. Their demeanor suggested certainty that the matter would end in their favor, as such matters too often did. Then came the sound of heavy doors swinging open. The air shifted. Every head turned. A hush fell over the room as Marcus Reed stepped inside, not in handcuffs, not as a man diminished, but draped in the unmistakable black robe of a judge. His presence carried a quiet gravity, the kind that drew every eye and held it captive. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in disbelief. Whispers cut through the silence. "Is that him? He's the judge?" The revelation struck like lightning, cracking through assumptions and prejudice in an instant. Miller's confident smirk faltered, and Kane's posture stiffened, his face drained of color. Marcus did not rush. Each step toward the bench was deliberate, echoing against the marble floor. The robe flowed around him, not as fabric, but as a symbol, a reminder of the authority he now carried, authority not given by bias or chance, but earned through years of resilience and mastery. The very system that had sought to demean him was now compelled to bow before his rightful station. He reached the bench and ascended. Standing taller now, above the same men who had forced him down only hours before, Marcus allowed silence to hang in the room. It was not the silence of humiliation this time, but of reckoning. His gaze swept across the courtroom. He saw Angela Morris, her hands clasped tightly as tears of relief welled in her eyes. He saw young Jamal, his shoulders squared once more, hope flickering where despair had settled earlier. The people who had watched him fall now saw him rise higher than before, and in their expressions Marcus found strength, not for revenge, but for justice. At last his eyes settled on the officers. Calmly, firmly, he spoke. "Gentlemen," his voice carried across the chamber, smooth yet unyielding, "you stand in my courtroom now." The words rang like a bell, steady and undeniable. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado dissolving. Kane swallowed hard, glancing down as if the floor itself had turned against him. The power dynamic had shifted, not with raised fists or angry shouts, but with the undeniable truth of authority rightfully earned. In this moment, the robe was more than clothing. It was a declaration that the years Marcus spent studying, fighting, and sacrificing had not been in vain. The spectators leaned forward, breathless. For once, they were not witnessing a cycle of injustice, but a breach in it. For once, the man who looked like them, who had been treated as less, was not only vindicated, but elevated. Hope spread quietly, like dawn creeping into a long night. In Angela's face, it was the hope that her children might one day trust in fairness. In Jamal's, it was the hope that redemption was not a dream, but a possibility. And in Marcus himself, it was the hope that perhaps his father's words, though heavy with truth, did not have to be prophecy forever. The courtroom, once heavy with despair, now brimmed with possibility. For Marcus Reed, the pain of the morning had not vanished, but it had been transformed. What was meant to strip him of dignity had become the stage where his authority shone brightest. He sat in his rightful chair, robe settled, gavel in hand. With one firm strike, the sound echoed, a reminder to all that justice, though delayed and tested, still lived within these walls. And for everyone watching, that sound was more than procedure. It was hope itself, made real. The hearing began without delay. The courthouse, still charged with the memory of that morning's injustice, was now alive with anticipation. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Clerks, attorneys, and citizens who had seen Marcus handcuffed in front of the courtroom recounted what they had witnessed. Their voices carried both outrage and sorrow, describing how the officers had ignored Marcus's credentials and belittled his presence. Through it all, Marcus listened. His expression was steady, his demeanor controlled. He asked questions when necessary, clarified details with precision, and gave space for every voice to be heard. What struck the room most was the absence of bitterness in his tone. He did not wield his authority as a weapon of retaliation. He did not raise his voice, nor did he allow anger to color his words. His authority needed no rage to prove its strength. The officers sat uneasily at their table, their earlier confidence eroding with each testimony. Miller fidgeted with his collar. Kane avoided Marcus's gaze. What had seemed, at first, a situation they could explain away was unraveling before them, thread by thread, until only the truth remained. At last, the time came for Marcus to speak. Rising from the bench, his robe flowing around him like the weight of history itself, he let silence settle before delivering his words. "This courtroom," he began, voice resonant, "is not a stage for prejudice. It is not a place where arrogance or bias can dictate the fate of those who walk through its doors. It is a sanctuary for justice, and justice requires clarity, fairness, and respect." He paused, his gaze falling directly on the officers. "When those sworn to uphold the law cannot tell the difference between a criminal and a colleague, when they allow racism to guide their judgment, they betray not only the individual they harm, but the very system they claim to serve." The words landed heavily, yet they carried no malice. They were not spoken to shame alone, but to illuminate. Marcus's voice did not shake. It commanded, and in that calm command was power. Finally, he lifted the gavel. The sound of it striking the block echoed through the chamber, sharp and final. "These actions," he declared, "have no place in this system. Not in my courtroom, not in this city, not under the law." For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then, from the back rows, a quiet applause began. It was not the raucous clapping of celebration, but something deeper, measured, steady, and full of respect. Families who had feared injustice joined in. Young lawyers, inspired by what they had seen, added their hands to the chorus. Even some officers in attendance, men and women who knew integrity mattered more than silence, let their palms meet in support. Marcus did not smile, though his eyes softened. He raised his hand slightly, and the applause faded. When he spoke again, his words reached further than the walls of the courthouse. "Justice must be more than words carved into stone above this building. It must be lived. It must be carried in the hearts of those who serve it, even when no one is watching." The room hung on every syllable. In that instant, Marcus was no longer merely a lawyer wronged, nor only a judge elevated. He had become something larger, proof that dignity, once crushed, could rise higher than hate, proof that strength could exist without fury, and that fairness could triumph even after humiliation. Angela Morris sat straighter, tears falling not from despair this time, but from relief. Jamal's eyes burned with a new determination, a spark that told him his story was not already written. And across the chamber, others felt it too. an awakening, a reminder that even in moments of deep injustice, truth could still find a voice. As Marcus set down the gavel, the courtroom felt changed. Not perfect, not fixed, but undeniably moved. His triumph was not only his own. It belonged to every person who had ever felt small beneath the weight of prejudice, every soul who wondered if fairness was a dream too fragile to touch. That day, Marcus proved otherwise, and in his proof, inspiration took root.